Welcome to Dark Wilderness, where I share encounters with the unexplained. If you have a story you would like to share, please email it to me in the link below. And if you like today's story, please gently slap that like button, as I'll be uploading 3 to 5 times every week. So please would knock that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's encounters. Back in the early 90s, Gunter and 2 of his friends had gone for a 2-week-long moose hunting trip up in northern Ontario. Now, these 3 guys were not your normal weekend warrior hunter types either. These guys had been hunting big game all over North America, and they had actually gone on a couple of safaris down in Africa as well for big game. So they were no strangers to the type of hunt that they were getting themselves into on this trip. Now, this area where they were going, they had been to it a couple times before, but it had been a few years since they had been out there. So Gunter said their plan was to get this float plane to fly them to the lake, drop them off for 2 weeks, come back, pick them up, and bring them home with whatever moose they got. So on the first day, when the plane landed, it went across the lake, and it went over to the area where they normally set their camp up. Everybody got off the plane, they grabbed all their equipment, all their gear, grabbed their canoe, and then they waved goodbye to the pilot. The pilot took off, and now they were alone for 2 weeks. Gunter said the first few days they were just kind of trying to get reacquainted with the lay of the land, just because it had been probably about 3 or 4 years since they had been out there. So they just wanted to refamiliarize themselves with everything. Gunter said the first week they didn't see any moose that they were able to shoot, so they were feeling a little bit bummed, and it was about day 8 they decided they were going to try on the other side of this lake. On the other side of this lake, Gunter says a spot that he typically normally liked to hunt, but they hadn't gone over to that side yet on this trip because they were seeing a lot of sign on the side of the lake by their camp. Now, after a week of not seeing anything on that side, they decided to broaden their horizons, so all 3 guys decided they were going to go hunt Gunter's spot on the other side of the lake. Now, Gunter said on the other side of the lake, he said that there's a bit of a hill that goes up, and it gets to about a 10-foot vertical cliff. So Gunter said you got to go up this hill, then you got to scale this cliff, and you get on to the top, and there's this ridge. And then he said this ridge looks down into a valley. And in this valley, he said it's just a big marshy swamp on the one side, and on the other side is just really dense woods. So Gunter and his buddy Mike decided they were going to post right up at the top of this ridge, and their other buddy Bob was going to go over and then down and hunt over along the side of this slough. So Gunter and Mike were up on the top of the ridge, and they were looking down into this valley, and all of a sudden Gunter spotted a big bull moose coming out of that thick woods towards that slough. So Gunter got his rifle up, got the moose in his sights, squeezed the trigger, and Gunter said this moose didn't make it 20 yards, and it went down hard right at the edge of that real thick woods. So Gunter and Mike high-fived each other. They called their buddy, they yelled for him super loud, called for Bob to come because they're going to need help field dressing this thing. So they waited on top of the ridge. Bob came up. The 3 men ended up heading down the other side of the ridge towards the woods to go deal with this moose. So the 3 men, they ended up field dressing the moose. They started to quarter it out. Now, the problem was their canoe, even though it was big enough for all 3 of them, it wasn't big enough for 3 of them plus a bunch of moose meat. So one of them was going to have to stay behind. So Gunter said, well, I shot it, I'll stay behind. You 2, you guys can take the meat back to camp, come back, and while you guys are gone, I'm going to start lugging what I can back down to the shore. So they grabbed the meat that they'd already taken off the moose, they brought it down to the canoe, loaded it up. Bob and Mike headed across the lake in their canoe, and Gunter was all by himself on the far shore. So Gunter stood there for a few minutes. Gunter said he ended up having a smoke, finished the smoke, put it out, and he said he was going to go back up now to the moose. He was going to start trying to process a little bit more of it. So Gunter said he goes back up that hill, up that cliff to the top of the ridge, and back down over towards the woods. Gunter said when he got to where they had been processing the moose was gone. He said the gut pile was there, and you could tell that they had been processing the moose there, but the moose itself was just gone. So Gunter started looking around because he figured, okay, maybe it was a bear. He figured that's the only animal big enough that might be able to pull this moose. And because if it would have been a pack of wolves, there'd be pieces of it everywhere, but there was nothing. So Gunter's looking around, but he said he didn't see any drag marks, nothing to indicate that a bear had come and grabbed the carcass and started dragging it deeper into the woods. So Gunter said he kind of kept his rifle handy, and he said he started to walk in like a semicircle around from where he was standing into the bush around, and then he went a few yards further and then made an even wider circle after that, figuring that if maybe a bear did grab the moose, it wouldn't have went very far, because typically when a bear will grab a carcass, they won't drag it too far. They'll drag it just inside the trees, and they'll bury it with leaves and sticks, basically just to keep it out of the sight of other predators, out of sight of the birds. But he said he couldn't find this thing anywhere. So he decided he was just going to head back to the lake and wait for his buddies to come back, and then the three of them could go look for this thing together. So that's exactly what he did. He went up that ridge, down, waited at the shoreline. About an hour and a half later, Mike and Bob came back. So he told them, hey guys, like, this moose is gone. And they're like, how could it be gone? You must have went to the wrong spot. Have you been drinking? Like, you went to the wrong spot. Gunter said, no, like, I was at the right spot. Like, I could see where we processed it, and it's just gone. His two buddies, though, they did not believe him. So all three of the guys went up that hill, up the cliff to the top of the ridge. They went down, went into the woods, went to where they had been processing this moose, and sure enough, the moose was just gone. So Gunter's buddies had no idea what to make of this. Like, they could have not wrapped their heads around how this moose carcass is just gone, because they're just like Gunter. There was no drag marks, no nothing. So the three men actually ended up fanning out, and they started going deeper into the woods, trying to find any signs of what happened to this moose. And Gunter said about 20 minutes later, all of a sudden he hears his buddy Bob, which was probably about 100 yards away, start screaming for them. And it wasn't just like, hey guys, I found it. No, it was like a full-on scream, like something had horrified him. So Gunter and Mike went sprinting off towards where Bob was calling them from. And when they got to where Bob was just pointing up. He wasn't speaking or nothing. He was just pointing up into this tree. So Gunter and Mike look up in this tree, and about 12 feet up, right in this tree crotch, is Gunter's moose. So the three men are looking at this thing, wondering what dragged like 1,300 pounds of moose 12 feet up into a tree. Now, as I had said, all three of these guys have hunted big game all over North America, and they even hunted in Africa. So they're very familiar with big cats, especially from in Africa. So they know big cats can drag a carcass up a tree, but that'll typically be a smaller animal, like a deer, or in Africa, like a gazelle or something, but not a 1,300-pound moose. So they're looking up at this moose, and they're just all speechless. They don't know what put this moose up in this tree. So they start to feel pretty uneasy, because they're wondering now, is there like some type of giant mutant cat that just pulled this moose up this tree, or like what's going on? So they decided they were just going to back out of there, and they were going to come back in the morning and try to figure out exactly what happened. So they actually hightailed it pretty quick back to their canoe. They got into the canoe and they went back across the lake to camp. They were talking at camp about what this could have been, like what could have pulled this moose up this tree, and not one of the three men had any reasonable answer as to what had done this. So that night they all went to bed, and Gunter said it was around 2 o'clock in the morning. All of a sudden they could just hear like super loud snapping, just loud snapping of branches and like big thick tree limbs just breaking. Said it sounded like a windstorm, like how loud the cracking was. So Gunter said he got out of the tent. He had a flashlight. He's looking around trying to figure out what's going on, figuring maybe there was a bear rummaging around camp, and it was just sounded loud because it was so close. But he said he didn't see anything. So he went back in the tent, and he said a few hours later, all of a sudden they could hear something just beating up their canoe. They could just hear the sound of the metal being thumped up against and just loud banging. So the three men thought maybe just by chance, maybe there was another group of hunters or somebody was vandalizing their canoe. So the three men ran out of the tent with their rifles and they went running towards the shoreline. And when they got to the shoreline, Gunter said this canoe was just completely mangled. He said it was just more or less almost folded in on itself, and there was no way this thing was going to float anymore. He said it was just absolutely destroyed. So the three men were now freaking out because they're trying to figure out what pulled this moose up a tree and what now just made a soup can out of our canoe. So they decided they were going to go back to the tent and they were not going to sleep for the rest of the night. There was only about an hour of nighttime left before the sun would come up anyway, but they decided they were just not going to sleep. So come dawn, they went to go check out the damage to the canoe in daylight to see if, maybe their minds played tricks on them. Maybe they were just nervous. Maybe the damage to the canoe is not that bad. When they got down to where the canoe was, they realized, oh, no, this damage is bad. This thing was literally like folded in on itself. So now they're kind of freaking out because they know that they're still out here for a week and they don't know who or what just destroyed their canoe and who or what dragged this moose up a tree. So they decided they were not going to go hunting that day. They were just going to stay at camp because now all three men were just too nervous to leave the camp. Gunter said every night for the remainder of that trip, their camp was harassed. He said the one night something actually came up to the tent and actually ripped a big rip right down the side of their big prospector tent. So the entire time that they were there for the rest of this trip, that they were just always on edge. They were having rocks thrown at their camp. Stuff in their camp was getting destroyed. Gunter even said that this one night they could hear screams, like real loud screaming. He said it would come from one side of the camp, there would be a loud scream, followed by a couple seconds later a loud scream on the other side of camp. Gunter said on the last day, the last night before the plane was coming to pick them up, he said that night was the absolute worst. He said all night it was just nonstop screaming of whatever or whoever this was in the bush. Just kept screaming all around camp. He said it sounded like there must have been about 6 people or 6 of these things. He knows that they weren't people. I'll get into that in a minute, but he said it sounded like there were 6 of them just screaming all night. And at one point it sounded like something was coming through the trees right towards their tent. So all 3 men, he said they jumped up and they just ran out the front door. He said they just ran out. They ran down towards the water. He said when they got to the shore, they all got their guns up and they were aiming back towards their tent because they don't know what this was that was running towards them. So they all had their guns up, and Gunter said all of a sudden this big boulder, he said this thing was like 2 times the size of his head, came flying in between him and Mike and crashed into the water behind them. So he said when that boulder came whipping past him, he turned to look, and I looked back towards camp, and he said when he looked back towards camp in the faint glow of the fire that they had left smoldering all night to try to ward off whatever these things were that were screaming, he said in the glow of the fire, he saw this creature that he described as being about 9 feet tall, completely covered in dark hair, and he said it had red eyes. He said these eyes were just staring right at him. He said he had his rifle aimed right at its chest. He said he doesn't know why he didn't shoot. He just felt like if he shot, that him and his 2 buddies were not going to be leaving there. He felt like if he shot this creature in front of him, those other creatures that were screaming at them all night would get him and his friends. So he said he actually just ended up lowering his rifle because he figured there's nothing I could do. Like if I shoot this thing, I'm dead anyway. So he said he just lowered his rifle. And he said as soon as he lowered his rifle, this creature turned and just ran off into the dark woods. Now, Gunter said that remainder of that night, they did not leave the shoreline. They just stood with their backs to the water staring towards camp. He said in the morning, it was around 10 o'clock, he said they could hear the plane coming. And he said it was just the biggest relief of his life and his friends' lives to hear this plane coming in the distance. Now, when the plane landed, the pilot asked, like, what happened? Like, your canoe's completely destroyed. What happened there? Now, Gunter said that he didn't want to tell the pilot exactly what happened because he didn't want the pilot to think that they were crazy. Gunter said he felt crazy after all this, but he says that this story 100% happened to him and his friends, and he said that his two friends will not talk about it even to this day. This was almost 30 years ago already. Now, Gunter said that if you ever come across one of these things, he said, and you're armed, not to try shooting him. He said just lower your rifle, talk calmly, say, I don't want to hurt you, please don't hurt me. And he said just to turn around and walk back on the same path that you walked in on. Now, I was talking with Gunter about this, and because I've heard stories like this before about animals being dragged up into trees. And Gunter said that he's done some research on that as well, especially after what he saw. And he figures that that was a warning for them to get out of there. And he said that if these things really wanted to get him and his friends, that they would have got them. He just figures that they were very territorial. And he says that basically, if you're out in the woods, it doesn't matter if you're by yourself, 1, 2, 3, 4 people. He said just always be alert. Always just kind of pay attention to the subtleties. If you hear the woods all of a sudden go quiet, just to know that, that means there's a predator in the area, and you don't always know exactly what that predator is going to be. And he said that there are things out there that we don't really learn about in school or you don't really see about on TV. He says so just to keep a very open mind and just be extra alert whenever you're in the woods. Late last October, Luke had headed out for a day of muzzleloading for whitetail deer out by the town of Marchand, Manitoba. Marchand's located about an hour southeast of Winnipeg, and to get to where Luke was going to be hunting that day, he had to drive down 15 miles of this old fire road. He said after driving down that fire road, he'd have to park his truck on the side of it and then walk 2 miles in on this little narrow overgrown quad trail. So on this morning, he parked his truck, got out, and he said as soon as he got out, he felt off. He said he can't quite explain what this feeling was. He just felt off, and it just didn't feel right. He felt pretty nervous that morning. So as he was grabbing all his gear, he decided he was going to bring in his 12 gauge with him, which is normally something you cannot do in Manitoba during muzzleloading season. You could only carry a muzzleloader or a crossbow. You can't carry anything else. But Luke did not care on this particular morning. He grabbed his 12 gauge, he loaded it with double-aught buck and slugs, grabbed his muzzleloader, and he made his way down this trail. He said after walking about a mile down this trail, it comes to a spot where the trail goes up this ridge. And he said right as he got to the top of that ridge, he said it was like he hit a wall. He said he just instantly had this feeling of dread that just came out of nowhere. So he stopped. He said he took a couple breaths, figured, maybe he's just on edge because of the feeling he had when he got out of his truck. So he just tried to calm himself down. After a few seconds, he tried to take a couple more steps forward. And he said as soon as he did that, that feeling of dread just amplified. He said he just had this feeling that if he kept going down this trail, something really bad was going to happen to him. So he said he just turned around and he started heading back towards the truck. After going a few hundred yards down the trail back to the truck, the trail forks off and goes north. Luke decided instead of going back to the truck, he was going to turn and take the trail north because he had another stand down that way as well. And he was out there to hunt, so he just wanted to hunt. So he was going to go sit in that stand, abandon going to that first one, and just hunt there for the day. So he said he made it all the way to his stand, no problem. He said he still felt pretty on edge the entire walk in, but it was nothing like he had experienced at the top of the ridge on that other trail. So he got to his stand, he climbed up, settled in, and his stand looks across this pine valley. And on the other side of that valley, on that other opposing ridge, is where his first stand is. That's the stand that he was initially going to go to. So he's sitting in his stand, and he's looking across at the bush line on the other ridge, and he can't see anything because it's so dark, but he can just kind of make out the silhouettes of the tops of the trees. So he's sitting there, And he said about 20 minutes later, he decided he was going to have a cigarette. It was still probably about an hour before sunup. So he pulled his cigarettes out of his pocket, and he said as soon as he went to light his lighter and that flame came up, as soon as that flame came up, all of a sudden there was this deep guttural scream from across the valley on the ridge where he was going to be hunting initially. When that scream happened, it startled him, and he ended up dropping his lighter to the ground. So now not only is he terrified because of the scream, because he's not sure what it was, but now he's dropped his lighter. He really wanted to have a cigarette, he said. He said so he went to look down, and he said when he looked down the stand, at the very bottom of the tree, he could see this dark, massive silhouette right at the base of the tree. So he said he's looking down at this thing, trying to figure out what it is, figuring it's probably a bear. So he had a tactical flashlight that he pulled out of his jacket, clicked it on and looked down, and he said as soon as that light came on, looking up at him was not a bear. He said looking up at him was this 10-foot tall Sasquatch just staring up at him. And he said as he's looking down with the light, looking up at the Sasquatch, he said this thing screams at him. And when it screamed, he could see its teeth. He said it's not like in a horror movie where they have jagged teeth. He said they were like big, flat teeth. But he screamed up at him, so he quickly grabs his 12 gauge and he's pointing it down at this thing because he doesn't know what it's going to do. He said as he's pointing his shotgun down at this thing, it turns and it just runs into the bushes. So he's still in a stand aiming down, just scared out of his mind. And he said all of a sudden there's another scream, but this time it came from the north, from to his left. So now he's freaking out because now he knows there's 3 of these things. There's one across this valley. There was the one underneath his stand, and now there's another one off to his left a couple hundred yards. So Luke said he just froze in place in his stand. He said he wasn't going to do anything until the sun came up. So he sat there for about another half an hour, and the sky was starting to turn gray at this point. And he's looking across that valley, and he sees 3 darker blobs on the other side of the valley along the tree line. So he's looking at them, and he's already thinking that, that those blobs are definitely these things that have been screaming at me. So he puts his 12 gauge beside him, and he grabs his muzzle loader. He lifts his muzzle loader up, and he said he cranked his power on a scope to maximum power, and he was looking through it, and he said he could make out the shapes, but he still couldn't really see anything. So he just kept moving his scope from one of these figures to the next and to the next. And he said he did that for the next 20 minutes until it was full on light. And he said as it got light, every time his scope would be on one of these Sasquatches, they would just glare right back at him. And that went on for another 15 minutes. And Luke had had enough now. Now it's full on light out. So he decided he was going to make a break for his truck. So he grabbed his shotgun, slung it over his one shoulder, slung his muzzleloader over the other shoulder, and climbed down his stand. As he was going down his tree on his climbing sticks, he turned and looked across the valley, and all 3 of these things instantly started running south, the direction that he was going to be having to go. So he hits the ground, he turns, and he just starts sprinting south down the trail back to where that fork is. When he got to the fork, he turned, and now he started running towards his truck. He said he didn't even make it about 50 yards, and all of a sudden he could hear something to his right in the bush. He could just hear the bushes just snapping and cracking, and he could hear something breathing real heavy. So he turns his head and looks, and one of these Sasquatches is running parallel to him about 15 yards into the bush. And he said this thing's just barreling through tree branches, and the tree branches are actually just blowing apart as it's ramming into these things. So he said he starts just running even faster than he ever thought he was even able to. And he could hear as well to his left, but slightly behind him, one of the other ones running along the side of the trail as well. And one behind him. He said he could hear these real heavy footfalls. And he said that last mile running to the road, he could hear all three of these things breathing real heavy, and every once in a while they would scream or yip towards each other. He said it was like they were communicating. He said he felt like he was being herded in a specific direction, which just so happened to be in the direction of his truck. So Luke's running down the trail. When he breaks the wood line and gets up to his truck, all the noise and commotion in the woods stopped. So he runs around the side of his truck, gets up to the driver's door. He goes to unlock the door and he looks, and all three of these Sasquatches are just staring right back at him from inside the bush line. So Luke opens his door, jumps in his truck, starts it, and he just floors it down this gravel road. He drove about a mile, and then he decided to actually turn around and go back, because he was going to try to get a picture of these things, hoping kind of that they were still on the side of the road. So he's driving down the road. He gets back to where he had his truck parked, and they're gone. So he rolls his window down, and he just kind of sticks his head out the window to listen to see if he could hear anything at all. And all of a sudden, he could hear crashing coming through the woods directly towards him in his truck. So he's looking, and that 10-foot tall Sasquatch was running through the trees, pulling a big pine behind it. He said when this thing got to the edge of the bush line, hauling this big pine behind it, he said it stopped running, turned, and threw this pine tree at his truck. He said the pine slammed into the back driver's side of the box, shook his entire truck, and it actually blew out his back window. So Luke at this point now, he just pops it into drive and he just floors it out of there. He didn't want to tell anybody exactly what happened to his truck because he didn't want anybody to think he was crazy. So he just told everybody that he was driving down a road. He ended up going off and ended up sideswiping a tree. Luke said, though, that this experience has shaken him. He says he will never go hunting again. He will never go in the bush again. His advice is if you're ever out in the woods, never be alone. He said always go with somebody, always be armed. And he said if you do come across one of these, just turn around and get out of there without them noticing you. He does not recommend pointing a firearm at them. He said he doesn't know if it was him pointing his muzzleloader at them when they were on the other side of that valley that made all three of them chase him out of there. But he figures that even if you would have tried to shoot one, he doesn't know how much damage it would actually do to them. He said they're just so big and so muscular that it would take a very large caliber to put one down. He said so don't let a rifle or something give you a false sense of security with these things, because he really doesn't think it'll be that effective. In late November of 2018, Brian and his buddy Dan were heading out to Brian's grandfather's property out in Juneau, Manitoba. Juneau's located about an hour and a half east of Winnipeg, and Brian's grandfather had owned this particular piece of land for about 30 years. And Brian grew up hunting out there, so he knew the area very well. And he actually had a trailer set up on the property that he used as a hunting shack. Just a place for him and his buddy to stay when they would go out there, so they wouldn't have to make the trip back and forth from the city every day. So on this particular trip, they had left on the Friday, but they had left pretty late in the day. And earlier in the week, it had snowed like crazy. So when they got out to the property and they had to go down this little narrow drive that ran about 200 yards and just kind of zigzagged through the trees to where the trailer was, the snow was over 1.5 feet deep. So they were having a little bit of a trouble with Brian's truck making it through there. But eventually they did make it through. They got up to the trailer, they parked beside it, and when Brian stepped out of the truck, the first thing he noticed was there was a whole bunch of footprints all over the place. They circled the entire trailer and they were just all over the yard, the property right by the trailer. So the first thing Brian thought was, great, somebody was trying to break into my trailer. So him and Dan actually walked around the entire outside of the trailer just looking for any type of damage, trying to see if any windows were smashed, if it looked like anything was pried open, and everything checked out okay. So they opened up the trailer, they brought in all their gear, And they actually just settled in for the night because they had to get up early to go hunting the next morning. So in the morning when they woke up, they had a quick breakfast and they were just talking amongst each other, trying to figure out where they were going to go. So Brian decided he was going to hunt the far east side of the property, and Dan, who's a bow hunter only, doesn't use a rifle, just a bow, was going to hunt about 300 yards south of the trailer. There's a small clearing that's about 75 yards wide by 65 yards wide, and that's where Dan was going to go. So the two guys, they got out of the trailer, they waved to each other, wished each other luck, and they split off and went their separate ways. Now for Brian, where he was going, he had to walk down this narrow, overgrown old fence line. And it ran about 600 meters before it got to the cut where he was going to be hunting, where he had a tree stand set up. So Brian said as he's walking down this narrow little cut, he made it about 300 yards, and in front of him he spots this dark silhouette on the ground. Now, even though it was dark, the moon was pretty bright, so with the snow he could make out shapes and silhouettes in the bush. So he sees this big silhouette on the ground. He's looking at it, trying to figure out what he's looking at in front of him. So he starts getting a little bit closer, and he starts to realize that this looks like a deer lying on the ground, but it's not moving. So he gets closer and closer to it, and when he's right up at it, he's looking down at this thing, and he could tell that the hind quarters were gone. They were just missing. So he instantly gets super mad because he figures for sure it's a poacher, because that's typically what poachers will do. They won't take the whole animal. They'll just take the hinds, the backstraps, and the head. So Brian's super mad now because he's like, great, somebody's poaching deer on my property. So he's super mad. So he just kind of keeps going down that narrow little fence line. The whole time he's just thinking in his head, great, there's poachers on my property. If I see one, I'm going to give them what for. So he said he walked the next 300 meters till he got to the cut line where he was going to be hunting. And he said right where the fence hits that cut line, there's a big poplar. And he said on that poplar he has a hanging stand that he has about 12 feet up in the air. And he has a set of climbing sticks up the outside of the tree. So Brian said when he gets to the cut line, first thing he notices is his tree stand is lying on the ground on the cut. So he's ticked off. He's like, okay, how did my stand fall out of the tree? So he's looking at the tree itself, and he realizes that his climbing sticks have also been ripped off the tree, and they're lying on the ground right beside the stand. So now Brian's even more mad, because now he figures that not only is somebody poaching on his property, but somebody's messing with his stuff. So now he's really, really ticked. But he decides, you know what, I'm out here to hunt. I'm just going to stand up against my tree, and I'll see what I see. And I'll deal with this after the morning hunt. So he was standing there for about 25 minutes, and off to the north, all of a sudden he hears a loud whistle. So the first thing he thought of was, okay, Dan must have decided not to hunt where he was going to hunt, and he's walking down this cut from the north, and he's just whistling to let me know he's coming. So Brian said he let out a whistle in return. So he's waiting, and no response. So he figures that's kind of strange, so he lets out another whistle. Again, no response. So now he decides he's just going to take out his radio and radio Dan to find out where he's going, because obviously he's coming towards them. So he pulls his radio out of his jacket, radios over to Dan to ask him where he is. Dan comes back over the radio and tells him he's in his tree stand where he said he was going to be. So Brian kind of stands there for a second wondering, like, okay, who whistled at me then? So Brian's like, okay, never mind. All good. Put his radio back in his pocket, but then he starts to think, like, hey, there are prints around my trailer. There's signs of a poacher. My stand is destroyed, and now I have somebody whistling at me from down to the north. So he's kind of paying attention to the north, and every once in a while he turned and looked to the south. And he said one of the times when he turned to look to the south, all of a sudden he heard a crack coming from the north. So he whips his head around, and he said when he turned around and he's looking north down that cut, he said about 125 yards away, he just sees this big silhouette of a big person standing right smack dab in the middle of this cut. So Brian said he's kind of yells at the guy because he figures that this person standing on the cut is more than likely the person that poached this deer, the person that destroyed my tree stand, and the person that was snooping around my camp. So he said he yells at this guy, and this guy doesn't move. So Brian gets super mad now, grabs his rifle, and starts walking super quickly towards this person standing on the cut line. He said he didn't make it 20-25 yards when this person in the cut line turned and just walked into the bush. So Brian kind of stopped, and he kind of started to think for a second, okay, well, if this person that just walked into the bush is the same person that was snooping around my trailer, that poached this deer and destroyed my stand, do I really want to be approaching them in the dark when I can't see anything and I don't know if they have a weapon? So Brian decided, okay, I'm just going to leave this area. I'm going to come back later. I'm going to find this guy and I'm going to tell him off. So Brian said he turned around, walked back to where his stand tree was, and then walked back down that narrow fence trail. He said he walked about 350 yards down, and he said there's a little bit of a clearing. And he said it's about 50 yards by 40 yards, and he has a tree stand, a ladder one, up against a poplar in that clearing. He said typically that's where he does most of his archery hunting, but he figured since the spot he wanted to hunt was messed up, he was just going to sit in there. He didn't really care at this point if he saw anything. He just wanted to sit for a bit, kind of calm down before it got light and he would have confronted this guy. So he climbed up in that tree. He said he sat there for about an hour. So when it was fully light, he said he climbed down, started to walk towards that skinny little fence line again. And he said he decided he was going to call Dan just to let him know, hey, I'm going to go confront this guy. So he pulls out his radio. The radio is his buddy. And his buddy actually came back over the radio and said, hey, I actually shot a deer with my bow. I'm tracking it right now. Why don't you come give me a hand, and then we'll both go together and we'll find this guy. It's probably not a good idea to go try to find him in the woods all alone, because you don't know if he has a weapon, and if this guy is doing all this stuff, it's probably not the best person to be confronting in the middle of nowhere. So Brian agreed and just said, okay, I'll come help you, and then we'll go deal with this guy. So Brian walked all the way over to where Dan's stand was in that small clearing. And when he approached the clearing, first thing he noticed was Dan's footprints heading south into the bush along a blood trail. So we followed the blood trail down, met up with Dan, and they actually ended up having to track this deer a super far away. It was a bad shot, and they had to track it about 2 miles. So by the time they actually found the deer and dragged it back to the clearing, it was already getting pretty late in the day. So Brian said, I'm just going to go grab the quad from the trailer and we'll pull it back. So Brian walked the 300 yards back to camp, got his quad, came back. They hooked the deer up and they brought it back to camp. They hung it up he has a big workshop shed with no door on it, just a big open space, just somewhere where they could go in there and process a deer without being hit by the elements, the wind, if it's snowing or the rain. So they hung it up in this shed. And then they were talking like, hey, well, it's only about an hour and a half before dark. Like, what are we going to do? We probably shouldn't go try to find this guy now. We'll just report him to the RCMP and make a statement and see if they have any idea who this might be. So they decided they were just going to go to their tower blind. They have a big box blind on the north side of the property, he said. So he says about 400 yards from camp. So they made their walk the 400 yards over to this big box blind. They climbed up. They settled in for the evening hunt for the last hour and a half. He said they didn't see anything. So right when it got dark, they decided, okay, it's time to head back to the trailer. So they grabbed their stuff, climbed out of the stand, and they started walking back towards camp. He said they had only walked about 150 yards, and then from behind them, all of a sudden he heard that same whistle that he heard in the morning. So he said instantly his blood pressure went up and he was just in fight mode now, because now he knows that this guy's just messing with him and he's going to give him what for. So he spins around, and same with Dan, and they see this silhouette of this big guy standing about 125 yards away again. So Brian just starts aggressively walking straight towards this shadow in front of him. He said when he got about 50 yards from this person, he all of a sudden realized, wow, this guy's big. This guy's huge. So he stopped, and he said he took out his flashlight and shone it directly at this guy. And he said when he pushed the button on his flashlight, he said his heart just stopped. He said standing in front of him was this creature that was 8 feet tall, completely covered in hair, and just built like a bodybuilder. He said when he saw this creature in his headlight, he said he just turned and just started running straight for Dan. He said when he got to Dan, Dan turned around and they both just ran all the way back to the trailer the whole rest of the way. He said they didn't look behind them once. He said when they got to the trailer, they jumped into the truck. He said he fired it up and he just floored it down that driveway all the way towards the gravel road. And he said as they were going down that driveway, he looked up in the rearview mirror and this thing was running after his truck. He said he just put his foot to the floor, hit the gravel road, and he said they just booked it all the way back to Winnipeg. The next day, they actually ended up going back. They went back though with 2 more buddies because they wanted to go get Dan's deer. They wanted to get all their stuff out of the trailer. Brian said when they got back to camp, Dan's deer that was hanging in that shed was gone. He said his trailer, he said the door was just mangled. Nothing inside the trailer was touched. He said it almost looked like somebody was like beating on the side of it. So he said they just got all their stuff and they loaded it up in the truck and they headed back to Winnipeg. Brian said he has not been back out there since, and he said that when he told his grandfather about this, his grandfather actually told him that he too had some encounters with these creatures, and Brian's grandfather had almost the identical experience. He was out hunting and he heard these whistles. He whistled back, and then this thing came out and actually chased him off the property as well. Brian's advice is if you're ever in the woods and you hear a loud whistle, he said don't whistle back. He doesn't know if whistling back makes these things aggressive or what, but he figures that's what triggered this one. His advice is if you do encounter one of these things, he said try not to make any contact with them. Don't try speaking to them. Don't look at them. He said just turn around, keep your head down, and just slowly walk out of there. Well, that's it for today's encounter. I just want to take a second just to thank everybody for your support. It's been awesome. And I just want to say thank you for coming back, and I'll see you next time.